My name is Martina Lauchengco. I'm an operating partner at Costanoa Ventures. I will also be your host for this evening. Thank you all for giving us the gift of your time. We plan to make good use of it. I promise we'll get you out of here by 7:30 so you can watch the Warriors game. I know that's important. We've got our priorities straight. When we started Seat at the Table, Costanoa, this was 3 years ago now, Costanoa wanted to make sure that we were inspiring conversations and action around having more women have more seats around more tables in tech. And as a boutique venture firm, we felt it was important to not just invest in the technologies and companies that were changing how business got done, but we believed it was equally important to invest in the people and processes behind how those companies were being built. And so that's why we created this forum. We know that this is a long journey that all of us will be on. We don't expect change to happen tomorrow, but know that this forum and every conversation you have after this can make a difference. Last year, we had a woman that was so inspired by this conversation. She went home to her husband and said, "You won't believe how inspiring this event was and how important having a diverse pipeline is and how much diversity can help improve company performance." And her husband, who was a VP of finance, or is a VP of finance at a high-tech startup, realized, he's like, we're feeling kind of flat in our company, and maybe it's because we're all white guys leading this company. He also realized he was interviewing for a controller position and that the entire pipeline he'd been interviewing was all male. So the very next day, he went to his head of HR and said, "I want you to make sure that 50% of my pipeline is women." And she started crying. And she said, "Thank you so much for asking this of me. It is so much more powerful when the leadership takes ownership than me trying to start this myself. This is how we create this change at this company." So it was one woman having one conversation that's now having a huge impact on an entire company. All of you have the power to do that, and that's what we hope to inspire through this conversation here tonight. I want to say one thing about tone. A few months ago, I attended this absolutely inspirational conference called the Watermark Conference for Women. Its founder is right here, so thank you for doing that. It's about women's empowerment and professional development. And this year we had Gloria Steinem saying, "Your time is now," and Brene Brown talking about authenticity and vulnerability, and Serena Williams, who is one of the most extraordinary, powerful women I've ever seen physically present. And in between these incredible speakers and workshops, you have this lunch where you sit down with strangers. And I happened to be sitting between two guys, which were the first guys I'd seen all day. And so I asked them, "What is this experience like for you?" And they said, "Honestly, it's really intimidating because the content and the conversations are really important and interesting, and we want to take them back to our teams, but they're so oriented around women that we don't feel like we're actually supposed to be part of this conversation." So tonight is meant to be very inclusive because we want to make sure everyone leaves here with conversations that they can have that create the change that we are all seeking. This would not be possible without a great partner providing this incredible space. We want to thank LinkedIn, Christina, there you are, for once again hosting us for a second year. She's the SVP and Chief People Officer at LinkedIn. Christina Hall, tell us about why this is an important conversation for LinkedIn.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Martina. Hello, everyone. As she said, I am Christina Hall, and I have the pleasure of leading people here at LinkedIn. And it is certainly one of the better parts of my job to get to welcome people to events like this one. I think it is so important to have this sort of dialogue with all of you here in all of your, different perspectives on so many questions and so many discussions, and I welcome you to LinkedIn. I also wanted to just talk a little bit about why I think tonight's discussion is so important. One of the big topics tonight is going to be about allyship and the importance of that. And I think it's really one of those things where when Martina asked the question, have you had, a special person who's done something for you in your career, who's taken a special interest? It just makes, for so many of us, we have these seminal moments that we think about, and that person who did that thing that made all the difference. You know, for me, good vibrations. Yes. For me, you know, I stood up when Martina asked the imposter question because I'm the head of people here. I've had the job for about a year and a half. If you would have asked me 10 years ago if this would be what I was doing, I would have no idea. I was very much in a different place in my career in terms of thinking that I was more like a lawyer and a compensation person and much less like an HR person. And at that point, I was managing the compensation team at Facebook. And I was there for a little while, and I wasn't quite sure it was a fit for me. And I was offered a position at LinkedIn. And at that time, Facebook was doing great, but it was also sort of the name brand. And I was like, well, why would I go to LinkedIn? And it seemed like a big quandary for me. And so I took a huge risk to send an email to my old boss's boss, the CEO at Intuit, this guy named Brad Smith, who's just actually stepped down from leading Intuit. I had worked with him from afar. We were not super tight, but I knew that he knew LinkedIn because he had our CEO, or had LinkedIn CEO on his board. And so I just shot him a note and asked if he had any advice. And Brad took the time that day when he got the email to call me and talk me through it. And it was so great to have someone take the time to walk through pros and cons with me and give his perspective on it. I felt like it was so generous of his time, and it helped make the difference. And then when we hung up the phone, he called Jeff Weiner, the CEO of LinkedIn, and said, "You got to have her." And it was so epic. And it ended up being such a great thing in so many ways, which was all totally born of just me getting over my anxiety of sending one email to the guy. That one email, which felt like a little beyond the comfort zone because we weren't, direct reports and we weren't close buddies, was the beginning of just this really nice moment. And, I won't say that I talk to Brad Smith every week or that we have developed this deep mentor-mentee relationship, but he was such an important ally. And I think that those kind of moments can be so impactful. And I know that as a woman, sometimes it definitely takes a little extra to get beyond that discomfort with doing something that might be pushing, might be a tiny bit beyond our comfort zone. And I see that in data all the time. So LinkedIn published something called the Gender Insights Report based on data we see of the 610 million members of LinkedIn. And in it, you see some things where you're just, it's a little bit cringeworthy because you see that women are 26% less likely than men to ask for a referral. So that's on LinkedIn. We're talking about an online platform, right? This isn't having to walk up to someone at a cocktail party or send them an engraved note. We're talking about, sending an email request on LinkedIn. Women, 26% less likely. And so think about how much sort of opportunity is being lost there because we know that referrals are one of the key differentiator to get people interviews and to get people jobs. And the other side of that is then what we see is as women apply for jobs, they are actually more likely than men to get the jobs that they've applied for on LinkedIn. I think the number is 17%. And then as you get to more senior roles, the number increases to 18% for women. So in a way, I'm sort of, want to make the early call to action to think about just those moments of being brave and taking that step. And I hope that tonight's discussion will lead to us thinking about these different ways where either you could stretch to be someone's ally, or you might stretch to ask someone to, provide some guidance for you in that way. And I'll hand it over to the panel.
For sharing such a personal story, Christina. It's really great to hear that. We all know, as we were hearing from Christina, that data provides clarity. Oh, okay, I'm 26% less likely to do this. I should do something about that. And last year when we had Rachel Thomas with us, sharing the women in the workplace data, people talked about how seeing the numbers in black and white made really clear what work remains for us to do. And so we asked her back because it was so well received. And so I'd like to bring up to the stage co-founder and president of Leaning, Rachel Thomas, to work us through the women in the workplace data.
Thank you very much for being here, and particularly for all you men in the room. There's a famous Gloria Steinem quote, which is, when the eventual revolution comes, you will get a pass. So thank you for being here. So I want to start with a question. What percentage of black women do you think have never had an interaction with a senior leader at their company? Does anyone want to throw out an answer? A little participation?
80%.
Okay, you are even more, I'll go right to 59%. You're a smart audience. I usually get caught with these a little bit, but think about that for a minute. Almost 60% of black women in today's workplace have not had an interaction with a senior leader. Just let that sink in. So that is one of our findings from the Women in the Workplace study. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's the largest study of its kind conducted in the US every year. We do it with our friends at McKinsey & Company. Over the course of the last 4 years, we've done it. 450 companies employing almost 20 million people have participated. This year, 300 plus companies are signed up, and we're about to field the study in the next, the survey in the next couple weeks. And interestingly enough, and I'm bracing you, this is a lot of data fast, and a lot of it isn't good, but I think it's validation for the women in the room, and I think it's a call to action for all of us in the room. But what the findings show us year over year over year is that women remain underrepresented at every level in corporate America, and we're stuck. The numbers are not changing. So the further you look in organizations, the fewer women you see. Just 1 in 5 C-suite executives is a woman, and less than 1 in 25 is a woman of color. So before I go further, I want to stop and pause for a second. And I just heard the LinkedIn data, so women need to do more. But what we see in our data, and we've seen it for the last 4 years, is that women are doing their part, our part. So if you looked at research from 15 years ago, it would say that men negotiated at higher rates than women. We don't see that. Women and men are asking for raises and promotions as often as each other. The other thing, it's been conventional wisdom for years that women are opting out. We do not see that in our data, and I want to say again, we have the largest data set on what's happening in the workplace, I think, of any organization in the US. Women are not leaving the workplace. They're staying at their companies at the same rates as men, and they're generally staying in the workplace as the same rates as men. In fact, only 2% of men and women roughly tell us that they're leaving the workplace to focus on family. And that is because most families need to have both people working and both people committed to bringing income into the house. So women are doing their part. So then the issue is, what else do we as people who care about this issue, as leaders, as organizations, what do we need to be doing? So I'm going to share 3 things that we see in the data that I think are important for you to understand. The first is, we don't think the glass ceiling is the real problem. And I want to be clear, there is a glass ceiling, and some women are hitting it. And for everybody, I think, knows, but for 30 years, we've been talking a lot about the glass ceiling. This concept that women hit an invisible barrier and can go no further. And again, There is a glass ceiling, but if you look at the numbers, the disparities at the top of organizations, both for promotion rates and hirings, have really started to close. What we really see is that women stumble on the way right in the door. So women are getting more college degrees for 30 years than men, and yet women are less likely to be hired into the entry level in organizations, just slightly less likely, but that means women are left behind from the get-go. And then at that first critical step up to manager, that first promotion that gets you on the path to leadership, men are far more likely to be promoted. For every 100 men promoted to manager, 79 women are, and 60 black women are. So by the time you get to the manager level in organizations, 2/3 of managers are men, and 1/3 of managers are women. I want to be clear, every organization has a different looking pipeline. This may not be the case for your individual organization, but if we look at what's happening across the workplace, these are the numbers. So let's stop for a second and think about what's the problem with this. 2/3 men, 1/3 women. That means there are fewer women to hire from the outside as you get further up the pipeline, and there are fewer women to promote in your organization. So you are literally stacking the deck against women right from the get-go. The other thing I would say is I think this points to a problem that we believe is of incredible importance at Lean In, which is there's too much bias still baked into hiring and promotions. So we know from a lot of research that we, and when I say we, I mean all of us, of all genders in the room, we are more likely to overestimate men's performance and underestimate women's performance. And as a result, research shows that women are often hired and promoted based on what they've done, what they've already accomplished, where men are often hired and promoted based on potential. We believe they can get there. We believe they can do it. And so if you think about it, where would this bias be most likely to rear its ugly head? It'd be at the very beginning of your career when you have less of a track record. So you can either say men and women must be materially different at the entry level in organizations, or you need to say there's something else going on. So one of the big things we think is happening is there's a lot of bias baked into the system. Also, I would suspect that since we've been talking about the glass ceiling for 30 years, organizations have put more focus at the director level, the VP level, the senior VP level to level the playing field, and now we need to shift our focus earlier in the pipeline. And we love numbers, we love math, so we did the math. And if we do not close the gender gaps at the step up to manager, we think we'll remain stuck. We do not think the pipeline will move. On the flip side, if we close the gap at the step up to manager, we think over the next 10 years, we'll start to see the numbers change dramatically in management. So we need to focus on the very beginning of the pipeline and that step up to manager. The other thing is, when we talk about women's experiences in the workplace, we rightfully talk about big issues like sexual harassment, equal pay, the maternal wall, or the bias that new mothers face. And these are all critical issues that we're doing work on as an organization, and I know many of you in the room are doing work on. But the other thing I think is really important for us to understand is women are kind of having a crappy experience at work. And this matters. So 65 or 64% of women experience what are called microaggressions. And I want to be clear, men experience them too, people of color, LGBTQ people. This is not something that is just reserved for women, but a lot of women experience microaggressions. And I'll give you a couple examples, and my guess is the women in the room will start to nod. Being spoken over in a meeting, putting an idea out on the table and then watching it run away from you and somehow it's someone else's idea. I've heard a couple been there's in the front. Having to provide more evidence of your competence, even though you have the expertise, being mistaken for someone significantly more junior. And here's the thing, and I've experienced them, and actually I'm willing to bet everyone in the room has experienced some of these things at some point in your career, regardless of what you look like, what your gender is, what your sexual orientation is. We've all experienced some of this, but it happens to women a lot, and what experts would say is the phenomenon is death by 1,000 paper cuts. Not one of these on their own are rocking your day, but when they're happening to you all the time, as part of your everyday day experience, they wear women down. So we know that women who experience microaggressions are 3 times more likely to think often about leaving their organization. So if you manage a team or manage an organization, I'm going to say that again. Women who experience microaggressions think about leaving their organization often 3 times more often than women who don't experience them. We also know that microaggressions are connected to another phenomenon that we looked at a lot last year in Women in the Workplace, which we call the only experience. So 1 in 5 women say they are the only or one of the only women in the room at work. Not surprisingly, senior level women say it more, and women who work in technical fields. And onlys are having a significantly worse experience than women who work with other women. They are more likely to experience microaggressions, far more likely. They report they feel left out, on guard, under pressure to perform. And they are twice as likely at some point in their career to have been sexually harassed. So I think that if we don't watch ourselves in our efforts to get to diversity, we sometimes end up with tokenism. We check the box. We have 1 woman, so 1 woman is enough, or 1 LGBTQ person, or 1 person of color, and that is enough. And true diversity, as we all know, comes with real numbers. Because think about this for a second. If you're the only in a room, you have additional scrutiny. You feel the pressure that you're representing everybody like you. You are less likely to speak up, push for your ideas, challenge the status quo, and yet that's what we need people in our organizations to do to be successful. So one way to think about this, just kind of maybe a mindset shift, is unfortunately we're not going to have more women until we move the pipeline. But I think conventional wisdom is I've got 10 teams, I've got 10 women, I'm going to put 1 woman on every team because check the box, I've got gender diversity. And I would posit that maybe a better way to think about it might be I'm going to put 2 or 3 women on fewer teams. I'm going to have some teams that are all men. And I'm okay with that because I believe the women on those other teams are having a better experience. And that matters. The other thing we see is that women of color face more barriers and get less support. And the numbers here are really stark. So women of color are promoted more slowly. They get less support from managers and senior leaders. And they experience more and more types of microaggressions. And you can see the numbers up here. This is particularly acute for Black women. And many of us in the room know this, but this is because women of color face biases for being women, and they face biases for being people of color. And these compounding or intersecting biases are greater than the sum of their parts. And this is so important for all of us to understand, particularly, again, those of you who lead teams and lead organizations, because here's the kicker. Women of color are more ambitious than white women. They are more interested in being senior leaders, top execs in organizations. So if we can figure out how to better focus on the unique experiences of women of color and lift them up, we are cultivating future leaders. So those are the 3 things I wanted to talk about tonight that the data shows us that aren't going so well. And now the 3 things that we can do about it. So the first, you read that and you go, treat gender diversity like a business priority. Doesn't everybody do that? And the reality is, I don't think so. The numbers do not tell that story. Because think about it. What do you do when something's a business priority? You set goals. You make them public. You track progress. You share metrics openly, widely with employees. And you hold managers and leaders accountable for hitting those goals, and you reward them when they do. We all know what happens in organizations is what gets tracked and rewarded. And yet, only 10% of organizations are currently setting targets for gender and race. 12% share a majority of their diversity metrics with employees. And I want to be clear, a much larger sharing a couple metrics, but only a small amount are really committing to share a majority of their metrics. And then only 16% of companies are holding their managers and their leaders accountable for progress on diversity. We need to treat it like a business priority, because it is. The other thing is we need to address bias in hiring and promotions, per my earlier comments. So we know that about less than 50% of companies mandate diverse slates, and less than 26% do for internal promotions. And yet there's a lot of research that shows mandated diverse slates work. So I'm going to use the NFL as an example, of a good example, so chuckles aside. Back in the early 2000s, the NFL put what's called the Rooney Rule in place. So for those of you who don't know what it is, it mandated that there was one person of color on every slate for head coaching roles. At the time they put it in place, just 6% of head coaches were Black or Latino. Today, that's over 20%. They've moved the numbers by always having mandated diverse slates. And two things I think are really important to say when we talk about diverse slates. One, everybody's got to be equally qualified. You don't put people on the slate that are less qualified, have less work experience. That is not truly a diverse slate. And then the second is the newer research shows us that one woman or one person of color on a slate is not enough. You really need two per slate to really move the dial. The other thing we know is only 6% of companies are using blind resume reviews, and yet the research around this is really clear. There's a lot of bias in resume reviews. So I'm going to share 2 data points with you. So one, there was a study done, if you took a resume, and all you did was replace the woman's name with a man's name. Same resume, nothing else changed. The odds of being hired went up by 60%. Similarly, in another study, if you took a stereotypically Black-sounding name and replaced it with a name that was not stereotypically Black-sounding, so Kamal to Greg was the exact study, and Letitia to Emily, it effectively added 8 years of experience to that candidate's resume. We need to work as hard as we can to level the playing field. Part of it is blind resumes, blind assignments, so we're really focusing on what people have accomplished. The other thing, and the good news is, a lot of companies, over 2/3, or about 2/3, actually, that's over 2/3, are using clear and consistent criteria for their hiring. But I would kind of throw out to all of you, I think that's table stakes. So first of all, I think it sounds good in theory, and it's hard to hold up on practice. And so we need organizations to be pushing further. So an example of an organization who's done a great job with this recently is Airbnb audited their performance review process. So they made many changes. I'm sure I'm shortchanging everything they did, but I'm going to share 2 of them with you. The first is they moved from qualitative, mostly written evaluations to a 5-point scale. Because research shows that when you move from qualitative to quantitative, it reduces bias. The other thing we know from research is that women tend to underestimate our own abilities, and men tend to overestimate theirs. There's a lot of research on this. I've done it with my husband a couple times. It's a data set of 1, but I've done it with my husband a couple times, and it turns out that that does indeed track in at least the Thomas household. And in all seriousness, they removed self-evaluations because they know that that can be a very biased part of the process. So pushing beyond clear and consistent criteria and pushing further is important. And then we know that only 19% of employees involved in hiring and 4% of employees involved in performance reviews get unconscious bias training. And that's just not setting people up to understand how implicit bias works, to understand how to check their bias. So well-meaning people are going into these processes and stumbling into bias pitfalls. And when I say well-meaning people, I mean all of us, I mean all genders, we all do this. And the final thing is we need to empower managers to drive change. So let me just dork out for a minute, but there's this concept in social science called the frozen middle. So you've got senior leadership, they're on board, they think that it's a great idea, they're all in. Rank and file employees are amenable to kind of making a shift, changing the culture, changing programs and processes. But if managers are not on board, it gets stuck. Change gets stuck in the frozen middle. And this makes a lot of sense, because for all of you managers in the room, you are on the front lines of decisions that impact who gets promoted, who gets stretch assignments. You're shaping the culture on your team. You have such an impact on your employees' day-to-day work experiences and advancement. And here's the thing, all of us, doesn't matter gender, managers are falling short. So when you ask employees, they will tell you that less than a third of managers consistently challenge gender-biased language and behavior when they see it, when it happens. Less than half of managers are encouraging a diversity of voices in decision-making, and only about a quarter are able to or are providing guidance on how to improve gender diversity. And I do not share this to beat up on managers. My bigger message is, what do companies need to do to empower managers to be part of the solution, to be change agents? So I already talked about unconscious bias training, but only 44% of managers get it. And I just don't know how we expect people to challenge bad behavior if they don't know what it looks like, and how to model good behavior, unbiased behavior, inclusive behavior, if they don't know what that looks like. So it's critical that managers get unconscious bias training. And then only 16% of companies I mentioned earlier are holding managers accountable, and people do what they're held accountable to do, and only 5% are rewarding them for making progress, and we all do at work what gets rewarded. And interestingly enough, a good example of this is back in 2015, Intel put a bonus in place actually for all employees. If they hit their diversity goals, they have met or exceeded their diversity goals every quarter since, and back to treating it as a business priority. When you say to all your employees, there's a bonus for moving the dial on diversity, you have made it a business priority. So before I wrap, I want to want a little plug for, we just released 50 Ways to Fight Bias, a new program, which I think is really relevant to a lot of what I share with you today. A lot of how we're going to level the playing field is, and let's be clear, there's big systemic issues, there's policy issues, but a lot of it also is getting bias out of our workplaces. And that means all of us need to understand how bias works and commit to be part of the change. So the program at the heart of it is a deck of cards, 50 cards. And on the front of them is a very specific example of bias in the workplace. So you're in a meeting and a woman colleague is spoken over or interrupted. On the back of the cards is a recommendation for what to do, and then a data-driven explanation, a research-driven explanation for why it happens. And the cards address a lot of things we talked about today: bias in hiring and promotions, microaggressions, how to identify them, how to interrupt them, what managers can be doing better, and really what we can all be doing better. And they are accompanied by a series of 6 short videos. And when we say short at Lean In, we mean short. They're 60 to 90 seconds each. We worked really hard to distill the information down to the very basics. 5 of them are on the most common types of bias that women experience in the workplace. And the 6th is on the concept of intersectionality, which is so critically important because, as you know, women of color, LGBTQ women, women with different backgrounds, experiences, education, disabilities, experience more bias. And understanding intersectionality is critical beyond just understanding what women are experiencing, because all of us experience biases because of different parts of our identity. So we, on the way out, we have sample packs for all of you, so you can grab a pack. And then online, you can find out more. The videos are online, they're free. There's a free presentation version of all the cards, and there's actually a free digital version that you can use on a phone or an iPad. So that is the end of my plug for 50 Ways to Fight Bias. And before I close, I just want to say what I think everybody in this room knows, but this is not just about lifting up women or lifting up people of color, LGBTQ people. This is about lifting all of us up because diversity really matters. We know people on diverse teams are more committed and work harder. We know diverse organizations generate more profits. We know they outperform their peers. We know they tend to be more innovative because there's a diversity of ideas coming to the table. So I know we're all here because we believe it's the moral thing, it's the right thing to do, but we also should not forget that this is what we need to do to be competitive and stay competitive. So thank you very much for your time. Please grab a deck of cards on the way out, and I can't wait for the following conversation.
Thank you, Rachel. It's always kind of stunning to see it in black and white, and beautiful colors too, about exactly what the data is and the situation that we're facing. We're going to take a quick 90-second moment for you to metabolize some of what you just heard and turn to your neighbor and have a brief conversation about what in the data most surprised you and what you think you might want to do about it. So just make a new friend. We're going to take a quick 90 seconds to metabolize this data, and then we'll move on to the panel. So in case you missed it, I neglected to say, despite the fact that you guys all signed an NDA when you came in, it does not mean that you can't take photographs and share this on social media. You are welcome to do that. They just wanted you, yes, so feel free, hashtag is her story. We're gonna move into the panel part of our evening tonight. And the way this is gonna work is we're gonna have them do brief lightning talks to introduce their perspectives and their stories. And then we're going to move into the panel section. If there's a question you feel moved to ask, feel free to tweet it to her story before 7:10, and we'll try and incorporate those into the questions that we're asking our panelists. So when we put together the Seat at the Table panel, it's always an exercise in trying to find totally amazing people that can really share great stories and tips for everyone that's here. And so I APB out to the network and say, hey, who's going to be amazing? And Sherry Mack, who's here, said, stop everyone you're talking to. You need to meet Nancy Douyon because she's amazing. And I met Nancy and I said, you're absolutely right. She's a user experience at Uber. She has a phenomenal story. And let's turn the floor over to you, Nancy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nancy Douyon. Can you guys hear me fine? Yes. Awesome. Well, turn up the mic. I do have some volume to my voice. I don't want to lose my voice again, but I do lose it quite often. Oh, there we go. So my name is Nancy Douyon. I hail from Haiti by way of Boston. Most people ask me if I'm from Port-au-Prince because that's the only place they know. I'm from Okai, Haiti, which is the south side of Haiti. We are farmers by the coast of a beach, so the dream. So my family lives in Haiti. I've traveled to about 70 countries. I consider myself a cultural human factors engineer. So I help tech companies expand into other countries and be conscious about how their products impact people from a cultural perspective. And so think of that in a sense of consciousness. You can't just spread things from little old expensive San Francisco to the next billion users. So currently I'm working at Uber and I'm helping them cross marketplace with their scale in what is called Uber Everything. It's everything, as you can imagine. But I previously worked for places like Google, Cisco, IBM, Intel, you name it, I've impacted it in some way. Pfizer, I've impacted designed their information site, Baxter, Mechanical Kidneys, things like that. And so I'm very, very passionate about something I call the 3 S's, which is systematic impact, scale, and change, social change. So especially from a systematic standpoint. So hopefully I'll get to share a lot more about the work I've done and how I've been able to do this as a multiple minority. I'm Latina, Black, queer, like everything. I'm serious. throw ageism in there because this skin, like, you can't tell how old I am. I tell you, just throw it in there.
Fully intersectional.
Fully.
Excellent. Well, likewise, when I went out to the network, I said, last year we had Nick Mehta, who basically left here with about 300 more super fans, and we're like, who can follow that? And my friend Mike said, I know exactly the person because he lives his values every single day, and he's built his company around being diverse and hasn't had to actually institutionalize it because it's been so natural for him. It is Ariel Cohen, who's the CEO and co-founder of TripActions. Ariel.
Yeah, so me and, it's interesting because we talk about metrics and diversity and all of these things, and it kind of brought me back to why we've started, me and my co-founder, why we've started TripActions. And it's actually our second startup, so we could actually ask the question, do we want to do it again? And I don't know why we came up with yes, but it's really about culture, right? I think that when you go and build your own company, it's really not about the money or the exits or the headlines and all of this. It's really about building your own culture, really, fostering the values that you believe in. And really that's in a lot of ways the story of TripActions. And when I'm thinking of what we are doing, which is really corporate travel, and it's about bringing people together to eventually meet face to face, you do it globally. So diversity is super, super, super important. So interestingly enough, I was listening to the stats earlier. At TripActions, 50% of the employees are women. And in fact, 57% of my staff are women, right? So very different. And I actually agree with you that it starts here, and it also needs to come from here. And interestingly enough, we actually didn't put any goals or stuff like that, but we are making sure that we are hiring correctly. And it's really value-driven hiring. So when we are hiring, it's actually first starts with values, mission, and only then we're actually starting to check, what is your, capabilities and experience and all of these things. And I think it really creates an impact around the diversity. So this is pretty much, my story. We'll have more questions, but definitely excited to be here and share more about what we do.
Thank you, Ariel. And likewise, I asked Christina, I said, do you know anyone, a director at LinkedIn that might have a really interesting story to tell? And she said, yes, I know the perfect guy. Because even though he's a senior director of talent acquisition at LinkedIn now, he started his career off at McKinsey and then was a senior VP of product marketing at Nielsen. So he understands all these different aspects of what it's like to be in a variety of different companies. So Chris Louie, please tell us about your story.
Sounds good. I'll tell you guys my D&I awakening story. So it took me about 21 years of living to actually get woke. And it's not that I was unexposed to or unaware of discrimination when I was growing up. I grew up in a small town in New Jersey, and I was one of 3 Asian kids in the school system because I have 2 brothers. And so I got my fair share of name calling. I got the fake slant eyes thing, all that stuff, right? But it's a little bit like that Kellyanne Conway quotes about the 2016 election, right? I was offended, but I didn't think that I was affected. And what I mean by that is, did well in school, went to a good college, got internships, got a job that was, somewhat attractive to people. And so while I thought I was perhaps seen as different, I didn't think I was treated differently. This is where the until part comes in. I didn't think I was treated differently until about 2 months into that first job out of undergrad. And I remember sitting in the office of the guy who was running the overall analyst program. And I was going to be helping out with recruiting the next class. So sitting there waiting for him, he comes in, bunch of papers in his arms, right? The guy stumbles, drops the papers, they splay all over the floor. I reach down to pick up a piece of paper to hand back to him, and I'm looking at it. Read it. It says, 1 black female, 1 black male. 1 Hispanic female, 1 Hispanic male. 1 Asian female, 1 Asian male. And I'm like, that's me. And so, what does that mean? I had a good run at that company, did well there, right? Got good ratings from my managers, et cetera. But a thought was incepted in the back of my head, right? And it was, am I here because of me? Am I here because of a quota? right? The entire time that I was there. And that thought, and that feeling still sticks with me today, right? As I'm at LinkedIn now, running inclusion recruiting, and as we are doing a lot in the D&I space, right? And as we think about things like Rooney Rule, and have it going on, right? And as we think about things like URG talent review, right? And as we have talent marketing, focus on specific groups. And as we have events where, a lot of the folks coming to a given event are of a certain complexion or of a certain gender, right? Basically, as we do all these things to drive out bias and to drive in equity, 2 words, in equity, I think to myself, hey, are we doing the things that will actually have people that are in attendance feel valued and not feel like, again, they're part of a number or part of a quota, right? And so what that tells me, what that does for me is it says, hey, like as we do these things, right, that are going to really drive better representation in our company, better diversity, we need to hold ourselves to a certain bar. And I think that bar really comes into play in the form of every person attending that event should have a feeling of belonging, right? We talk about this at our company a lot. We talk about diversity as in, hey, let's look around the table and let's see who we're inviting to the table and ensure we're inviting a diverse group to the table. We talk about inclusion in terms of let's ask them for their point of view. Let's give them the opportunity to speak, right? But then we also talk about belonging. Let's create an environment where they feel that they can actually speak their minds, right? And so that's what we need to do, again, as we try to drive diversity in our company. So that's what I think about. That's my diversity origin story, and excited to be here talking about this.
Great wise words and a wonderful story.
Thank you.
Keri came into my ecosystem through an executive search. And sometimes you will you take these calls and these meetings, not because the person is necessarily the candidate for the job, but because you're trying to calibrate the market. And I met Keri and thought she was absolutely phenomenal. And so when we were trying to think about who would be great on this panel, I reached out to her and she said, yes, I'd love to do it. She's the Chief Platform Business Officer at Xero, which is one of the leading SMB accounting software firms in the world. Keri, share your story with us.
Excellent, thank you. And I was equally impressed when I met you. It was really awesome to see your passion for this and other topics. So just to kind of give you a sense of my experience from a career perspective, I have found a real passion, you don't hear this often, for financial services and banking. I know, blowing your mind right now. And what I love about financial services is it is an industry that is inherently complex, often does the wrong things, deeply in need of complete rethink and reinvention, and it matters. It matters to people's lives. What we do, the work we do at Xero is incredible because we help small businesses change the odds of success. And statistically, about half of Americans either own or work for a small business, and we know they're the backbone of the economy. And so I found my way, in all the sexiest industries you can imagine: accounting, banking, a bit of investments and wealth management. And so it's been a really incredible journey. And now I've sort of bounced between technology and traditional financial services. And it's been an incredible experience. And I've had the opportunity to do really significant kind of game-changing roles, like running small business bank for Capital One and sort of really kind of fixing what was going on. And, the thing that's been interesting, though, is, I didn't know what my career was going to be when I started out. In fact, I started out in a very traditional household. I have a lovely family. I had all the good support. My dad worked for DuPont. I went around the country every 2 years moving with him, so I'm a corporate brat. But he had very traditional expectations for me. And his expectations I would be an awesome wife, an awesome mother. And I love those ambitions too, and I think I've done a pretty good job there, or a reasonable job. And what was really interesting is, he wanted me to be educated, but there was just no ambition there. So I similarly had no ambition for myself other than to be a great wife and mother, which again is a fabulous ambition. when I got through school, I started working, and of course, I started out in advertising and marketing because it sounded sexy. And I had to start working because, darn it, I wasn't married yet. And so I started working, and I really discovered quickly that I have no creative capabilities, but that I'm fantastic at tenacity and business development, and also thinking about the strategy behind the marketing we were doing. And one day I went to GE and I knocked on the door for a sales call, went in and chatted with them, and they called me back and said, hey, we'd love you to come work at GE. And I called my dad and I said, I just got a job offer at GE, which at the time was an incredible company for leadership and development and winning in the marketplace. And my dad said, are you sure you're ready for that? And I said, yes, I am. And I walked right in. And the thing that's been amazing, I've had wonderful support, but I've really discovered how to develop my career along the way and found my way. And I'd sort of share with you, I'm excited today to share with you everything I screwed up, because there's a lot of that too. But the thing that I really has stuck with me and been kind of tenets of my success have been find something you really care about, that you're super passionate about and intellectually curious. Typically, I also find that in places that the company has ignored that have massive potential. Say yes to everything that you can afford to do, time-wise, but raise your hand. And I've also really said yes to experiences I didn't choose, but that have ended up being incredible. And then finally, really making sure that I'm owning my path. And so we'll talk a lot about that. I don't just lean in. I control very deliberately what I do, and I build my world around me that I think can help make me successful. And I believe that every woman and every man can have it all. It's just what that definition looks like for them. So I'm excited to continue the conversation about the journey that we've all mutually had.
Fantastic. Well, since you brought it up, I'm going to start with failure that you learned from, and the most powerful failure that you really brought forward with you as it helped bring shape to your career. So, Ariel, let's start with you.
It's actually related to our previous startup. We sold it really, really, really early. And when you do that, it's, as I said earlier, it's really not about the financials. You kind of look at this and you said, okay, so I've just wasted a year of my life, building this startup that ended up being a feature in another kind of company. So it really helped us, and I did it with the same co-founder, and it really helped us to really, reflect and think, okay, when we were doing the next one, right, how are we going to do that? What kind of markets are we going to address? Kind of how do you build a long-lasting company? So this it was a failure, but it was a failure that really actually brought us to TripActions. So it was actually an important one.
Brought clarity to what you wanted to bring to whatever you did next. Nancy, how about for you?
So I'm great at failure. Someone should give me an award for it. But I really embrace it. It is great. I mean, I think that the one thing, I've worked at a lot of companies. I just named a lot of top companies that a lot of people dream to work at. And the one consistent thing I've seen with these companies is that I work around people who are looking for the next gold star. They're the straight A students that don't know how to validate themselves, so they wait for you to validate them with their quarterly performance reviews, right? And so when you start to see that your own esteem comes from kind of other people's perspectives, you kind of start to wonder if you're seeing the world correctly. And luckily for me, I've been to over 70 countries now, and so I understand culture and failure very, very differently. Everything is a learning opportunity, and what a gift that is. I'll share a particular story. You guys can tell some things not like the other here, right? I'm in yoga pants, Ethiopian garb, and things are about to get real. Can I cuss?
Yeah, absolutely.
We just gotta get that out the way. Don't know if children are watching. So shit's about to get real, right? I remember a time that I was working at Google on a project called, at the time, Project Fi. Do you guys know what Google Fi or Project Fi is? It's Google's wireless phone network. I was one of 5 researchers, one of 5 people. I was the first researcher on that project. And within a half hour, they taught us how to build a phone network, which blew our brains and told us we had 1 year to put it together, which can be a bit overwhelming. I was tasked to, in a think tank type of way, build the differentiators within this product that would make us a global, praised entity. And I remember I was so excited about it. I came up with, I want to say 1,000 ideas, but I only showed them 300. And they said, great, we'll take 7, right? And eventually, as I got closer and closer to launch and realized that with limited resources, we weren't going to be able to do everything, they said, we'll take 3, we'll take 2. We'll take 1, nothing, right? And you know, companies where you have to launch pretty quickly, you can't just say, well, nobody took my idea. So I went to Ethiopia. I know that doesn't make sense in the grand scheme of things, but I wanted to prove that some of the points that I made in some of these divine differentiators were going to make a difference if we considered them. And I am a believer that there's a reason why people like black things or underrepresented things. There's something about giving somebody the least resources that scales really well across the globe, right? Think about it from a financial standpoint. If I have nothing and you've given me the worst part of pig and I'm making bacon, that's probably going to scale well, right? And so here I am coming back, and there's whispers around the office about somebody who had ran up some large bill in Ethiopia, and I was quite impressed because I was the only black person on the team, and nobody thought I did it. Come on. We are getting places, right? And so here we are, and I'm like, who would do such a thing? You know, at this point, our team had grown to, I want to say, probably about 40 people, and I knew I was going to be called into the office, and the whispers were that the bill was about $1,500, right? Great. $1,500 is a drop in the grand scheme of tech, right? Maybe. I get to the office where they set me down, and I had a report ready, an explanation ready for me. And they said, Nancy, did you take a look at your bill? And I said, well, if you consider some of the design implications or things I had suggested, there are things in this report that are going to completely change the way this product works around the globe, especially in the United States. They kept interrupting me and saying, Nancy, did you look at the bill? Well, you know, I just want to talk about why I would take the chance to go to Ethiopia and do something like this. Like, look at the bill, Nancy. I had in one day lost $27,000 in Ethiopia. And so it's not like I did it on purpose. I wasn't trying to spend that much money, you know. And they asked me, what do I have to say for myself? And the comment I made was like, oh my God, I just saved you guys $1 billion. I mean, this is amazing. Because I found something that they probably did not consider. And I won't give you too many details about why in this particular case, we have a government like Ethiopia charging $19,000 per gig to access their internet. And we're trying to entertain the world by saying, hey, for just $10 per gig, you can get on this platform. I'm pretty sure none of you would like to see a bill with $19,000 per gig with the data running behind your software because of your Facebook Messenger. Yeah, I don't want that, right? And so as a result of that, I actually ended up getting a platinum award. Amazingly, right? I mean, right, a failure that turned into something that was really rewarding by taking a risk. And in general, the way I see failure is not like failure. I think after working in tech for so long, over 15 years, I've started to see it as an opportunity to show new things. So now I can talk about failure in a way that's always rewarding. You know, I think that people look at me and they assume that, oh God, she's gonna screw everything up. And you know what? I love it. If I'm gonna stand out, I'm gonna stand out, right? And I'm gonna turn it around and turn it into a story that's going to be a winning story, because with every failure, there's something to learn. That's where you can have the opportunity to create guidelines. That's an opportunity to shift the way you do things. So, you know, that's my little story of failure. I just kind of smile through it and hope for the best. Please don't lose $27,000 in your company. This is not an advertisement for that.
Keri, you shared a story with me in one of our conversations where you had a particular leadership style earlier in your career that you have evolved massively in the last 4 or 5 years. And it was easy to look at where you were and say, like, well, that's supposed to define success, but you found a new path to it. Can you share a little more about that story?
Yeah. So coming into financial services companies early in my career with no experience, no expertise, and no plan for what I was going to do was pretty scary. My background was advertising and creative, and so I started taking advantage of every opportunity I had to learn, which meant getting my MBA, which GE funded, which was amazing, really making sure I took advantage of all the learning opportunities, so getting my Six Sigma Master Black Belt. But the behavior there's a really bad behavior that I also learned, which is how to fit in. So I spent most of my career in a really great suit with like a pop of color and feeling like I needed to be like everybody else around me. Now, like many of you, particularly in financial services, I spent a lot of time in rooms with mostly men who were awesome men, but nonetheless, I always felt a little out and a little different. And so I learned to sort of put on the garb of sort of fitting in, which also included things like having all the answers, developing this persona that I sort of carried. So I was afraid to curse in meetings. I was afraid to be who I am. I was afraid to have open conversations. Now, I really asserted my perspective in meetings. But I also sort of did it in a more tentative way. And so I spent a lot of time looking perfect and making sure that I had all the answers, that I was never off. I prepped like a maniac for everything I did, which made me feel really comfortable. But once I started managing people, kind of ruined their lives a little bit because I over-prepared for everything. Just saying. And so as I got more senior in my career, I continued to hold on to these things because I thought they were the reason that I'd been successful. I thought my personality of being perfect, having all the answers, never being wrong, was precisely what people wanted, and that it was the enabler of my success. And I see a lot of nods in the room. What became really apparent as I got further along in my career is that I'd spent, this sort of time, and they say like you spend your first 40 years like building up your armor and the next 40 tearing it down, which is pretty much what happened. And my team, what I realized is that I wasn't comfortable being who I was at all. I was terrified of it. I had this amazing leader at Capital One, John Witter, who's now over at Hilton, and he brought in a whole conversation into our company about diversity that I didn't realize I was terrified of. In fact, all the women left the room and rewrote all the things we thought, and then we presented them back, and I was literally shaking standing in the room. This is just 5-6 years ago, because I didn't want to talk about the fact that I was a woman. I didn't want to be honest about that. It was like, I don't even want you to see who I am. I mean, obviously they know I'm a woman, and that I've got a husband and kids and all of those things. But what I realized is I had been being something that wasn't authentic, and it was starting to create distance for my teams. And I realized that I just wanted to be who I was, and that all of that work that I was doing to project something perfect was creating a capacity constraint for me. And so I started having real conversations. I started going to these different groups, and they said, hey, Keri, we want to hear from you. And I just started talking about all the things I'd screwed up and who I am and what I'm passionate about. And people came back to me, including my own team, who I knew really well at this point, and they said, I just like you more. And they said things like, I get it. And then they started sharing their stories. And I realized that there were some things that I was doing, and hopefully it won't take you this long, that were blocking my own capacity. So when I stopped doing that, I realized I was spending a lot of time putting up that front and a lot of physical energy. My team started feeling more comfortable being who they are. And I started making deeper friendships at work. Do you know, and I don't know if you guys have ever done this too, in my Facebook, I had a Facebook for friends, and I would not let anybody I worked with on it. Ever, right? And I don't do anything that crazy. I mean, come on, I've got a bunch of kids, and I basically work a lot and hang out with them. But I was so afraid to let people in. And it was funny, I was talking to an old boss, and he said, and I was kind of sharing this sort of revelation that I'd had. And he goes, we're friends, right? And I was like, oh, yeah, we are friends. But this sort of front was prohibiting me from getting to the next stage in my career, because people couldn't know me, and there was almost an invisible barrier. And so while I hate to admit that it took me so long to sort of realize that, once I did, magic started happening. Magic started happening for my teams because I created an environment where they could be themselves. I created capacity. I made deeper friendships with people at work that will endure forever. And I've been having more fun. And now at Xero in particular, it's been really important to me as I've come on board, and I've been there for a few years, to create an environment for my teams where they can be myself. And I'm having the most fun I've ever had in my entire career. And they're right there with me, and we're gonna all be lifelong friends. But it just took me way too long to get there. So I hope that's helpful to some of you, but a little bit of perspective, and always hindsight's 20/20.
So Chris, in your particular role, we've all talked about diversity, and it's easy to carry that forward, but how do you make sure that the conversations you have with hiring managers, since we're talking about management, isn't one about diversity, and it really is one that is grounded on teams that are highly productive and are performant, and there's an environment where everyone feels they can come and be their best self at work? How do you make sure that that's the conversation as opposed to hiring and diversity?
Yeah, so two things. One, to your point, you have to start with the actual need of the hiring manager, the need of the organizational leader, the need of the business. And then you have to find the connection point between that and the need for diversity, right? like all those stats that we saw earlier, right? The reference to, more diverse teams perform better in lots of different ways, all valid, right? All legit. And we need to trumpet that stuff all the time. But what I would assert is that that's insufficient, right? Why is it insufficient? It's insufficient because people can get it at a kind of 30,000 foot level, right? Or at an academic level, but then they get back to their desks, right? And then they think about, if they're a salesperson, the number that they need to hit, right? If they're a product person, hey, we need to ship this product, right? We need to get, this amount of user adoption or, whatever the stats are that you're looking for. And so if they're really going to live it, if they're really going to feel, if they're really going to believe, that message of, hey, this drives better business performance, you need to get specific and you need to force them to get specific. And you actually need to have the why question, right? The why discussion. But it's not why in the sense of why would I have a more diverse team or why would I prioritize this? Like, that's table stakes. Like, this is where your culture comes into play and your values, right? And how your leadership team is really role modeling, right? Yes, diversity is our #1 priority, right? Christina, Jeff Weiner, they say it all the time and they say it consistently every single time we have an all hands and in their leadership team meetings, right? That's great, but you need to then have the discussion around, hey, like, this is why diversity matters for your team and this is why it matters for whatever, all the way down to this rec. So link the actual, link it to the specific business need and specific business performance.
So some things you brought up that are really important are culture and values, and that being the grounding for a lot of the conversation. And Ariel, you shared a story with me about how, despite not having goals and metrics that you measured yourselves around, you created values and a way of being with the company that just let those things organically grow. Can you share that with the rest of us?
Yeah, I think there was this period in time in Silicon Valley that VCs started to have the founders signing like this diversity things. And actually, I didn't want to sign it because I thought, and I think you made this point earlier, that it's all about setting a goal of, okay, we need these ratios and these metrics. It's about values. It's about hiring correctly. And interestingly enough, we never at TripActions had any diversity goal. And we are usually measuring it after the fact. So in fact, the stats that I've shared, we needed to pull them out like before I came here. So we knew that we are kind of okay because, you kind of look around you, but we never really, made it a point to go and measure and put metrics around that. What we are doing, and we're paying a lot of attention, it starts with me and then my staff and then everybody, we are making sure that there is you don't see any type of discrimination. And it's interesting because what I saw actually is that when it comes to payroll, even if you are you can have, as I said, 58% of my staff are women, right? So you'd expect that, as it goes, through the organization, payroll at least would be equal. And you definitely see some bias there against women, right? And then those are things that we definitely paid a lot of attention and corrected. So it is important for me. It is important for my co-founder. It's important for our entire team. But it's also important for us not to be that deliberate and put these kind of goals, because eventually we have business goals, but definitely to be extremely cognizant of, of the various things that can impact any type of bias across the board.
Can I add something on top of that? So, we have a different stance toward goals. We have goals, right? We state them. Our executives have put them into their OKRs. We think it's important because it helps us understand kind of where we stand and whether or not we are making progress and whether or not we're making enough progress. But I would second the point on values. I think the values are not just critical, but probably the most important thing. Number one, because it ensures that you're living out those goals authentically, right? And then, not in a forced way or in a compulsory way. And then number two, they're the things that actually keep you doing the right things as a company when nobody's looking, right? And I think that's critical, right? And that is what allows you to create and have trust in your workforce.
Really quickly, we'll just go down the line. Nancy, who was your biggest advocate in your career?
It's probably the people who actually doubted me. But before I get into that, do you mind if I piggyback on the things that you both said?
Yeah.
So I will tell you guys straight up, I'm not a fan of diversity. Not a fan of it. I feel like they are looking for individuals like me who they're trying to increase, and they talk a lot about trying to, numbers, like you said, but not necessarily trying to retain the talent that they have. Right. And also, I think we talk so much about diversity from the standpoint of values, but we don't actually talk from the standpoint of who's actually impacted at the end of this. So, I'm going to always look at things from a product standpoint. When Snapchat first released their technology, for example, they didn't recognize that their technology was creating yellow face for Asian features. So they were literally laying slants on people's eyes. When water faucets first came out with light sensors, I don't know if you guys know, light bounces off a light. So when you put something dark under there, what do you think happens? Absorption. So go get you a black friend and go find a light sensor in a bathroom and see what happens, right? So the point is, I get to see every day of my life as being an actual minority in the field, as a different person in the field, how, to an extent, clueless some of these products are going out and impacting people. And so when they get into the homes of the next billion users, and I'm saying it doesn't even work for me, that's pretty shocking and disappointing. In fact, when I even teach or talk about design, I've done presentations where I've done talks that are called diversity in design, inclusion in design, and I'll tell you the last one in a moment. When I've done diversity in design, the people that show up are Black and Latinx people. When I've done talks that are called inclusive design, Black, Latinx, and Asian people started introducing this concept called humanizing design. Guess who shows up? White men, right? Shocking. It's the same talk, right? It's the exact same talk. And so I think part of understanding, at least for me, when you try to talk about values, I think part of it is understanding your own bias, your own implicit and explicit bias, and being okay and accepting that. So the example I give is, if I were asking you to build a mobile for my child, I'm sure you weren't trying to ruin my child's life, or like a baby. I think it's pronounced mobile, right? The little thing that spins around, mobile, depending. All right, English is a second language. But right? So you have this thing rotating. If I asked you guys to build it for my child, I'm not talking about gender, maybe a baby boy, baby girl, you might say, let's throw some stuffed animals, some airplanes, some trucks, some planes. You're really providing me some of your empathy. But here's where your empathy doesn't go far enough. That baby is looking at the bottom of stuffed animals and the wheels and different things. It's not that you didn't care. It's that it's really not that easy sometimes to see the perspective of another person. And so what's happening right now in industry is we're running around kind of speaking for the other individual and not actually presenting them to speak for themselves, right? And so I coin myself as a person who can look at any product in industry and tell you the gender and racial makeup of their team. I am so serious about this because most things don't work for me. So it's like an easy, peasy kind of deal. But to answer the question that you had about the role models in my life, in my culture, Haitian culture, we don't believe in role models per se. Yeah, I know you didn't say that word. We definitely admire a lot of people. We believe that each of us are meant to be unique and different, and there's something very beautiful about our individual light. So I love whatever this is, But I do admire the people that doubt me. Right? I really do. Again, I'm from the Latinx spectrum, so I'm going to come a little fiery with things when people doubt me, right? So I'm like, you don't even know what you did, right? Not even sure. But, I remember, I won't name the company, but I worked as a human factors engineer, and I remember walking into a room, and there was a couple things I noticed right away when I started this job. One, the people would speak to me and say, you know what, let's take it easy on you, Nancy. And then I would see the Asian guy sitting next to me sweating like balls, right? And they're like, let's give him the hardest problem possible. And I'm like, why does he get an opportunity to learn and I don't? Or I'd go into a room, and many rooms, and security officers will stop me and say, I'm sorry, this is a private space for engineers only. What do? For me, I changed up my weave every day to be like, gotcha, same black girl. But not everybody has the opportunity to do that, right? So I got a really early start in learning that when people doubt you, I turn it into humor, I turn it into opportunities. I've been dragged into rooms where they offered me severance packages because other people reacted racist-like or sexist behavior towards me. And I really feel like it's not about trying to I guess I would say Band-Aid these labels. I hear these constant talks of the same things over and over and over again in tech. But let's talk about what's actually bringing us here. Let's talk about the actual products that are impacting. Instead of just saying the same thing about like, it's important, I know it's important, but nobody cares. That's the reality of it. Nobody seems to care that it's important for us to all be in the room. So I like to show it by proof, showing you like, hey, guess what? Because you didn't consider women in this product, you lost a lot of fucking money. A lot of money. Because guess who's making the household decisions? You think it's the men running around making these decisions? The women are the influencers. So if you don't appeal to us, guess what? Ain't nobody spending no money, okay? So it's really about talking, I think, in that instance, like being as honest as possible about these things. And so my haters are my motivation. Thank you. And so hopefully I answered that question.
I think one of the really important things that you're talking about also are like the labels that we put on these conversations, even the labels that you put on the exact same talk, and who decides that they are part of that conversation as a basis of that. And just as an invitation for everyone who is here in this room, if you go back and say like, I want to have a diversity conversation in our office, it's the same people who will show up. And you really want to make it as inclusive as possible around performance, around values, around business imperatives, around you don't want to lose $1 billion. And that's going to bring far more people into the conversation and into the dialogue, which is what we really all want to have. I have one question from the audience that we'll try and get to really quickly, which is, how do you act as an ally for employees from underrepresented groups? Does anyone want to take this on?
I can actually maybe describe a project that we are very soon going to start. So, you think about every startup, every company here in Silicon Valley, it's very much entitled. People are kind of starting to assume that, you get equal opportunity and life is great and all of this. So we thought a lot about it, and we asked this question: how can we show our employees other kind of people, minorities, other people that actually we didn't think that had the opportunity to be successful to begin with. So we actually partnered with Shaka Senghor, who is basically have this, it's called ARC, which is how do you bring people that were in jail back to society. And you can think about a lot of roles in startups, in tech companies that could be relevant if you give people the opportunities. Of course, there has to be some process and training and learning and these kind of things. But what we think, and we'll see, it's pretty much at the beginning, we think that it will actually provide perspective to all of our employees of what actually equal opportunity means. Because it's, you kind of sit here in our HQ is in Palo Alto. You cannot really think about equal opportunity when your entire perspective is something between Stanford and, in our HQ. So I think that's really part of how we are thinking of providing other kind of perspectives.
I'd also add, one of the things that I think is really important is to be what you are representing in the marketplace, and in big and small ways. So I've the great fortune at Xero of, for the first time in my career, working with our founder, who had a 50-50 board, 50-50 leadership team, 50-50 team across the board globally, and was really committed to doing that. We have a ton of work to do on ethnic diversity in each of our markets, but really excited for the first time to work at the table with at least equal representation of women and men as a start. And we are a New Zealand-based company that's kind of gone worldwide. We're in 180 countries. And we are taking a lead in our marketplaces on establishing goals, being much more aggressive about going like at every level through the company, and really being out and sort of in the marketplace on LGBTQ, representing in our communities. And it's something that has been really important to the company. So making sure we are leading our markets as much as we can and going further, that one step forward. In Australia, they're just starting to actually require boards to be 50-50. And so now we're sort of getting well ahead of that and establishing broader sets of goals, not just on gender diversity, but in ethnic diversity as well. I'd also say, like in very small ways, it's kind of awesome to work with a cohort. I've never before had a group of women that I get to work with every day where we get to command attention. So we recently brought in the CEO that transitioned from the founder to the next person, and he had some different perspectives, which we didn't agree with. And we were able to collectively say, that's not okay for our teams, and to sort of reach out on behalf of the team and from a more powerful position and say, hey, we need to make sure that our goals are more aggressive. We need to make sure that we're not, and also things like, you can't say that. Like, that's not okay. And it's just given us a lot more power at the table. So I think it's really important to drive and be an ally by being what you want to be. And we're not quite there, and so I don't want to sort of say that we've got it all figured out, but we're really making an effort, and then and being leaders in our market, and then really going that extra mile to really push for change with the folks that are at the table, which is kind of amazing. So, and it's just kind of got to be in big and small ways every day, every day.
And Keri, I think one of the things you're talking about is there's what you do as an organization from a leadership perspective, but then Nancy, part of what you were talking about was it's what we do as individuals every single day and how we live forward what we're talking about. So it's not talk, and it's actually just walking the walk.
Can I add 2 steps to that? Step 1, recognize your privilege. Even I have it, right? Step 2, leverage your privilege. Like literally leverage it. If you know you are in a position that may be a bit more powerful, step aside and give somebody else an opportunity to shine. So I'll give you an example where I recognized my privilege. I'm not gonna name the company, but I went to a company sale conference and saw that all their speakers were white folks and all their performances were black people. They had a drum line, they had a jazz band. They even had a white woman get on stage and say, you know what I feel like doing because these sales numbers are so good? Like doing the Dougie. That's 40 black children ran out of the audience to show the audience how to do the Dougie. Somebody in front of me was like, you can do it too. I'm like, we can find you another job. We don't have to do this, right? But what I ended up doing by leveraging my privilege in that moment with there was 13 out of maybe 17,000 salespeople in the room. I went and spoke to the head of the person because that was the space that I could do. And I said, hey, did you recognize that that was a disaster and really quite embarrassing for me as a person of color, right? To sit there and watch you basically tell me what my worth was as far as arts and entertainment. And you know, the comment that was given to me was, but we've done this before. And I said, well, I guess you didn't do it with me because I'm gonna speak up about these things. And so again, if you are in a room and you are a white male and you see that maybe you're speaking a little bit much, maybe fall back, you know what I'm saying? Maybe look for a woman and say, you know, I'd love to hear what Nancy has to say. Maybe it's not about the quotas. If you don't like the numbers, that's all right. But you still have an opportunity to leverage your privilege to actually get somebody into the room to increase the managers that are women in this field. You guys just saw these numbers. What are you gonna do now with that information? Hopefully you'll do something differently. That's what a real ally does. It doesn't just talk about the fact that, well, I believe women should be paid fairly. What are you doing about it?
So that is perhaps a perfect segue to your next assignment, which is to make sure you have 2 minutes to process everything that we've talked about here on this stage to figure out what your action plan is. And we have 3 things for you to think about. 1, we'll go ahead and change the slides to an allyship, an advocacy workshop that's actually being put on by our friends at SAMI, which is on June 18th. Thank you very much. This is where you can register. It's bit.ly, ally is a verb. And if you want to go deeper on what can I personally be doing to become a better and more effective advocate, this is a place where you can do that. We'll also tweet it out. You also have on all of your seats a little card called Deal Me In, which might give you an idea to inspire how to make your own workplace more inclusive. I picked this one out because we are guilty at our firm of being bad about this. Ensure you don't assume women on your team will do the housekeeping chores like taking notes or bringing the birthday cakes. Rotate these roles so all are on a level playing field. This is something we can do better at. So this might inspire your conversation. And then, of course, you have the postcard that has some other specific tips and tools for advocacy provided by our friends at Acuity Works. So go back to your same friend that you had your 2 minutes with. We're going to take about a minute and a half to process all of the things that we just said so you can develop your own personal action plan of what you want to do when you leave this room and do differently tomorrow. So we'll take a minute and a half to go through that. Thank you very much. All right, I know there's so much that everybody wants to do, and it's always a hard thing to close this down because we could listen to these guys forever. I do want to say a very special thank you to our amazing panelists. You guys are phenomenal, and we wish we had more time to get more of your stories, but hopefully you will stick around and share some of them individually. I also want to take another opportunity to thank our hosts, our generous hosts at LinkedIn for having us, hosting us in this amazing space. Christina, thank you. let's tell people about that rather than doing it just because I think we're out of time. So Chris is just going to tell you really quickly about a way that you can use LinkedIn to find everybody that was here. So just tell them what the name of the feature is.
So find your buy. So really quick, obviously it's important to keep this conversation going, like foster the community. A way to do that is connect with some of your neighbors that you just spent many minutes talking to in different breaks. So the way to do that is you go open the LinkedIn app, you make sure Bluetooth is on, you click on the My Network thing on the bottom, right? The little people symbol on the bottom, and then in the middle of the screen toward the top, you should see a Find Nearby. So you can look around, you tap that, and then it will populate with a list of other people nearby.
As Rachel was saying, it's going to bring up everybody that's in this room. You can do that as we're closing things out. I want to say,
it wasn't working last week.
Quickly before we break, I want to say another special thank you to the people that actually make this evening possible, and that is everyone at Team Costanoa. If you guys could all stand, Team Costanoa. Team Costanoa. And also a very special thank you to someone, guys, if I could just have your attention because this person really needs to be recognized. She was the very first person I told about Seat at the Table, and she said, let's do it. She's been my partner in crime in making it happen ever since. Rachel Kwan, thank you so much. And before I bring the final person up on stage, I want to end with a really quick closing story, which is this weekend I did my first mother-daughter 5K at a race called the Mermaid Race, which by its name you can assume that it was intended for women. People came dressed as mermaids. Everyone in the race chute was a woman. Everyone registering us was a woman. But the moment we got out on the race course, the first guys directing us at a turn were men. And the very next place where the path was diverging, you could turn left, you could turn right, it was men that was showing us the way. And I kid you not, 90% of the people out on this course, handing out water, supporting us, cheering us on, were all men. And it really struck me because it felt very much like, gosh, this is the perfect metaphor for my career in tech. And that it's always been the guys showing up, supporting me, pointing out the way to go. And it has been really helpful in shaping me reaching my finish line. So the message is not just to run your own race, but whatever race that you are running in your career, make a point of showing up at someone else's. Be their support, help point them to the finish line, hand them that water along the way, be their advocate, because that is how all of us win. The last person I want to say thank you to bring up on stage for our closing remarks is my biggest advocate. He's been my boss for multiple times in multiple companies, multiple years. He's the founding managing partner of Costanoa Ventures. He's going to close us out, Greg Sands.
Okay, so there's an obvious question of why am I here? And the first answer to that question is because Martina Lauchengco is amazing. So let's thank her for her leadership in putting this together along with Rachel and in starting the conversation in the context of our firm and continuing the conversation industry-wide. And look, we just, I think what you guys said today, continue to live your values in big and small ways. And that is literally all we're trying to do, is to live our values in big and small ways. We want to create an extraordinary venture capital firm that works with founders to create extraordinary companies, and many of them are here. But it's also the case that extraordinary companies are places that are inclusive at their very core. They're places where people feel a sense of belonging when they come to work because they're committed to the mission at hand, not just punching the clock. And we want to be a firm where people feel that way when they walk in the door. And so this is just one part of our doing our job, and we thank you for being part of our journey and part of the conversation with us. Thanks very much.
Thank you guys all so much for coming. You can get on to your Warriors game. We'll be here on stage for a couple more minutes. Thank you very, very much for being here tonight.